The Madison Historical Society welcomes you to the first of a four-part Lee Lecture Series for 2022. We'd like to thank the John Brady and Roberta Islet Fund of the Madison Foundation for their generous financial support of the Frederick Lee Lectures. The theme for these four lectures is Connecticut's First People. And today's lecture will be presented by Dr. Lucianne Lavin. Dr. Lavin is the current director of research at the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. Dr. Lavin received her MA and PhD from New York University, and she has over 30 years of research and field experience in Northeastern archaeology and anthropology. She is a member of Connecticut's Native American Heritage Advisory Council and editor of the Journal of Archeological Society of Connecticut. During her term as research associate at Yale University's Peabody Museum of Natural History, she co-directed their Connecticut Prehistory exhibit. Dr. Lavin has written over 200 professional publications and technical reports on archaeology and ethnohistory. She has received numerous awards for her work in archaeology in both Connecticut and New York. Her award-winning book, Connecticut's Indigenous People, was published by Yale University Press, and her recent book, Dutch and Indigenous Communities in the 17th Century, Northeastern North America, was published by SUNY Press. And now I take pleasure in presenting Dr. Lavin.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you all for joining us for this introduction to Connecticut Native Americans' histories and culture. I probably should say that it's really a complex subject. It's not like these people were small groups of childlike hunting and gathering, simple cultures, and stayed that way until the Europeans came. No. They had a very long history, and it's a very complex culture and very sophisticated belief systems. And like our culture and like any culture, it was an organic cultures. There's no one Native American culture either. There are hundreds, thousands of Native American cultures out there. And just like our culture, it's an organic object that changes through time. So there are many periods within this cultural continuum where they are constantly changing. We know less about the deep history, which is the pre-European contact history, because of course there's no written writing. We just rely on archaeology and oral traditions for that. But to give you an example, this is a summary of cultural chronology in native Connecticut. And it's actually made up of four main stages: Paleo-Indian, which are the earliest occupants at present, Archaic stage, Woodland stage, and the thing is in my way here, and the post-European settlement page. And then under each of those stages, there are 10 periods. And in fact, Paleo, there's more than 10 periods actually, because this is an older slide. And now the Paleo-Indian specialists actually divide Paleo-Indian stage into early, middle, and late, as we do in Archaic and Woodland. And the post-European settlement can also be divided into several periods: the colonial period, the federal period, and modern period. And each of those periods is defined by different characteristics. Each have defining characters about them, not only in material culture, but also in the non-material culture. there are definite changes through time. Usually with the material culture, it's added on and it accumulates. And also there are physical changes in the environment during each of those periods that distinguish them from other periods because people reacted to these physical changes in specific ways. So I could actually give a 2-semester course on this title and still only go into the basics. So there you have it, and that's what I'm going to do right now is pretty much summarize through this on the history and culture. Okay, it's not moving, Jennifer. I don't know why.
Maybe click on the presentation again, or well, maybe not. There you go. Click on it there, and then try to use your arrows again.
There we go. Okay. This is a historic map of Connecticut, and there are a number of historic maps of mostly New England and the Northeast, purporting to show the tribal locations at certain periods of time. And most of them are, virtually all of them are inaccurate, especially where Connecticut's concerned, because a lot of those maps will just show Mohegan Pequot in the southeast and maybe Mohican in the northwest, and maybe one other tribe. So in other words, they usually show about a half dozen tribes. As you can see in this particular map, there are 17 to 18 different tribes. This is a map that was made by Harlan Griswold in 1930, based on the extensive research by Matthias Spies, who was a local historian. And it was published in 1930 for what is it called? I can't read it from here. Connecticut Society of the Colonial Dames of America. And it still has some problems with it. There are some inaccuracies, but this is the best published map that I have seen on the locations of native tribes. This is purported to be in 1625. And as I said, what it does is it shows the homelands of the tribes that Spies believed were in Connecticut in 1625. There are about 17 or 18 of them. It also shows those thick black lines are major Indian paths in the area. And it also shows the location of major native villages that are mentioned in the colonial documents. And those are, I don't know if you can see this, but for example, right here in the Hammonasset homeland, you can see there's this little circular thing with little teepee-like symbols. That means it's a village. Now, as I said, there's certain inaccuracies. For example, over here in the southwest corner, Siwanogs. There is no tribe called the Siwanogs. It's found on a Dutch map, an early Dutch map. But basically, what Siwanog means is people or place of Siwan or Ziwan, and Siwan is the name for the purple beads that are called wampum. They're made from the hardshell clam. And that particular clam is found from about the Jersey coast up to Cape Cod. But obviously, southwestern Connecticut was closest to New Amsterdam. And so probably major trading partners with the Dutch making manufacturing Siwan. And wampum was extremely important to the early European traders here because they could use it to go up into upstate New York and Pennsylvania, which were far away from the coast, and trade, bringing Siwan and trade for a lot of beaver and other furs, because wampum was used by native peoples in political dealings and spiritual dealings, and so it was much desired. Anyway, I digress. But so that area where Sewanog is in southwestern Connecticut, Greenwich, Stamford, and also all of Westchester County, that was actually the homelands of a tribe known as the Geck. And of course, obviously, are no longer in Connecticut, at least the political entity isn't. So over here, as you see that that big yellow arrow is pointing to, and most of you know this, that is pointing to present Madison, and it was the homeland of the Hammonasset tribe. And it was also that village, that Hammonasset village, is located really at the crossroads of three major Indian trails. There's the north-south trail. There's my, yes. That takes you right from Long Island Sound right into that village and all the way up through Wangunk territory into Agawam tribe and on into Massachusetts and probably all the way up to Canada. There's also an east-west trail leading from that village going into Mohegan Pequot and then Nipmuc territory. And the third trail, this is a major trail, this is the Great Coastal Path that takes you westward into the village of Manhattan. Manhattan was a major village of the Geck, and on into the west and eastward, it takes you all the way up the New England coast into the Canadian Maritimes. That is now the Boston Post Road. In fact, most of the trails in Connecticut, not only the major trails, there were many minor trails as well, are now part of our highway system and also our railroad system. So, and I probably should mention something about the Hammonassets. A major tribe, of course, homelands in Madison, Clinton, Killingworth, and adjacent areas. And someone once asked me, I gave a talk somewhere, I forgot where it was, and they asked me what happened to the Hammonassets. Well, what happened was that Uncas, who was the grand sachem of the Mohegan, and a very powerful personage in, I think it was the 1640s, it might have been earlier, but he marries the daughter of the grand sachem of the Hammonassets. The Hammonasset sachem was Sabanakwash, I think that's how you pronounce it, and his daughter was Shumshuk. And he marries Shumshuk and has a son who becomes Adawanhood, and eventually becomes a major Mohegan leader. But by that connection to the Hammonasset, Uncas then claimed all of the land of all the homeland of Hammonasset and sold it. And therefore sold it right out from under. In fact, there is a children's book called, I think it's called The Man Who Cried, about Sabanakwash, written by the late Dale Carson, who was a Native American Abenaki woman who lived in Madison. So anyway, and also a historian and a great chef. She had a column in Indian Country Today for years, and also was a major force on the Hammonasset Society. So anyway, what happened was that Then he forced many of the people to move into the region of the Nehantic, who were under Mohegan's thumb at the time. And so a lot of the Hammonasset merged with the Nehantics and eventually merged with the Mohegans. But not all of them. Others moved out. And when we get to this later, there's a lot of movement going on during the colonial period. So a lot of them moved out, and a number of them stayed behind because Native people traditionally thought of land very different than Europeans did. Europeans saw land as a commodity. You sell it, you buy it, you make money, you lose money. Native people thought of it as being very spiritual. It was a gift from the Creator to the people, and it was the tribe who used it. And there was no such thing as single proprietorship. They had no idea what that was, and that's what caused major problems later on when the Europeans came. So their deities, their spirit world is within their homelands. Their leaders and their ancestors lived and died in those homelands. There's a lot of oral history in those homelands, and they don't want to leave it. So, and a number of them do stay there. In fact, there is colonial evidence that there were enclaves of Hammonassets living in Madison, Chillingworth, and Clinton right into the 1800s. There were villages there. And a lot of times, of course, these villages become communities of people of color eventually. So I think I've said everything I want to about this particular slide. Well, you can do it. So 17 to 18 different tribes living in Connecticut in 1625. And here we come into the 20th century, and Connecticut only recognizes 5 of them. And this is a quote from an official statement during Native American, I think it was Native American month by John Rowland. And he's basically, and of course he says, whereas Connecticut further recognizes that the indigenous tribes, the Schaghticoke, Pawcatuck Eastern Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, Mohegan, and the Golden Hill Pocahontas are self-governing entities possessing powers and duties over tribal members on their reservations. And Governor O'Neill said the same thing in the 1980s, I think, 89, I think, because that is when, in 1989, the Connecticut State Legislature actually put into the general statutes, Public Act 8368, that the state recognized these 5 tribes as self-governing tribal entities. And so the reason I bring this up is because in around 2000, 2003, 2004, both Eastern Pequot and Schaghticoke went for their federal recognition and got it. And there was a big outcry by state leaders, and they actually got the federal governments to overturn those federal recognitions. And then there were people out there who wanted to take away the state recognition of the tribes because they said they weren't Indians. Well, yeah, they were. If you look in your Connecticut public records, they're listed there, and they're listed in all of the state records right up to the present, especially in the overseer records. Connecticut has an overseer system where, and they instituted this early on. For example, I know this, I think the Schaghticoke has an overseer system dating to the 1750s, and I'm sure the coastal tribes go even earlier, but I can't remember the dates. And basically, these are upper class white men who are put in the position of literally overseeing these tribes, and not just the reservation. I mean, there were anything of people living on that reservation were under the thumb of these overseers, according to a number of interviews I had done with Scattercook and other people through the years. So anyway, be that as it may, I just wanted to make the point that these are real Indian tribes, and they've been here a long time, and they have been recognized by the colony and state of Connecticut. And unfortunately, there's only 5 of them that are recognized, because there are still Native American tribes in the state who are not recognized. Now, if you get anything out of this talk, I hope you'll remember these 5 characteristics of Connecticut tribal peoples. And it's not just Connecticut peoples, it's all New England peoples, and in fact, all indigenous peoples in our country. Longevity, they've been here a real long time. Continuity, they've been here continuously. They didn't all die off and go west, and what we see are casino people, casino Indians. That is not, and I've heard that term used by people. That's not true. Complexity, these cultures were never simple, childlike. They were always complex. I really believe that this complexity and sophistication came over from Asia. That's how early these characteristics go back. And adaptability. It's a miracle that we actually have Native American communities in southern New England, because this area was one of the first where Europeans traded and settled. And and of course there was, as everybody knows, there were a lot of problems during that period. There was erasure of cultures, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a miracle that we actually have communities here, not just, some few Indian families that were left behind. No, these are actual communities that continued from the pre-colonial period. And it's basically because they were so adaptable. I have a friend and colleague of mine, Trudy Richmond, the late Trudy Richmond, who was a wonderful person, extremely knowledgeable. She was a Scattercook elder. She was on their council. She was actually tribal chairman at one point in the 1980s. Trudy was an author, an educator. She had degrees in anthropology and education. She was an educator. She was a master storyteller and many other things. And she once said, and I think she actually wrote this too in one of her articles, that it was much better to bend like the willow than to stand tall like the oak. Because you know what happens when you stand tall and you're a tree in a big wind, you're gone. And I'm going to say a little bit about these 5 characteristics. Come on now. Longevity and continuity. We know they've been here a long time. How do we know this? Because we have radiocarbon dates from 2 Paleo-Indian sites in Connecticut. One is the Templeton site, located in Washington, Connecticut, actually discovered by archaeologists from the museum I work at, the Institute for American Indian Studies, in the, I think late 1970s, early 1980s. Roger Moeller started, Dr. Roger Moeller started, actually discovered the site. And then with the we have a couple of radiocarbon dates from it. The earliest one is 10,300 years old. So it was the earliest Paleo-Indian site in southern New England for many years, until 2019, when the Brian D. Jones site in Avon, Connecticut was discovered with a radiocarbon date of 12,500 years. So we know that these people have been with us for at least 12,500 years living in Connecticut, and probably earlier, because the Wisconsin glaciation covered Connecticut. You probably all know that, for thousands of years. But around 7,500 years ago, the southeastern corner of Connecticut was ice-free. And then by 16,000 years ago, most of Connecticut was ice-free, and it was a grassland, a tundra that was very attractive to large herd animals, mastodon, mammoth, caribou, bison, and of course, those animals are very attractive to people as major food products. So Paleo Indians probably moved into this area much earlier than 12,500 years ago. We just haven't found their sites yet, because both of those sites that I mentioned were under 5 to 6 feet of soil. They're very deep. Most archaeological excavations in Connecticut only go down a couple of feet. And you really, to find these early 12,000, 14,000, 15,000 year sites, you've got to dig down about 6 feet. So now we know that they've been here continuously because we have radiocarbon dates from all over the state, from archaeology sites showing us that from 12,000, 10,000 years ago, Native people were continuously living in Connecticut. And then, of course, when the Europeans came, we have historical documents on these Native people. And of course, an example, well, I'll get back to it. I want to talk a little bit about complexity. Very complex, and this is an example, very complex economies and complex technologies. And you can see it here, for example, some of their technology, their heavy woodworking tools in the lower right-hand corner here, these heavy axes, adzes, and gouges, they're all made of basalt, which is a very good tool, a very good stone type used for chopping. They look like our axes and adzes that we have today, and they work just as well, except of course these are made out of stone. They didn't have metallurgy until they were introduced to it by the Europeans. And our tools, of course, are made from steel. Same thing with these polished, carved fish hooks. And we also have, what are those other things called? I'll think of it. Anyway, they look just like our stainless steel fish hooks, and they work just as well. Up here, this is a drawing of an annual seasonal round. It's from my book, my 213 book on Connecticut Indians. And it shows the annual subsistence round for the late Archaic period, which was 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. And it was a broad spectrum economy. They procured a great variety of plants and animals for their diet. And this particular round just shows the major staples that were procured during different parts of the year. And in the center, those are food products that they could get all year round. And there is quite a bit of them. In fact, let's see if I can go back here. Yeah, over here down in the lower right-hand corner, that's the Morgan site in Rocky Hill. It's a late woodland site that dates from 1150 to 1360 AD. And at that particular site, we found evidence of over 33 different types of plant materials that they collected. And that wasn't a year-round site. That was a base village that was occupied during the late spring, summer, and early fall. And we also found, I think, over a dozen of animal types as well. And this area that we only excavated an area like, I think it's something like 30 by 20 feet. And we found evidence of all that. And the site, of course, extends much further into that field. Also, what did I want to show you? Oh, down here in the lower left hand, these are, most of these are projectile points. Most of them are spear points until you get into the very late period. And then you find the bow and arrow is actually introduced around 600 E. And what I wanted to point out was there's a variety of stone types that are used in these various projectile points. There's a variety of chert or flint. There's quartzite. There's quartz. There's rhyolite. There's felsites. There's argillites, and almost every one of these. And this is a period that goes from, I think it's about 4,000, yeah, probably about 5,000 years ago, up to the historic period. Virtually every one of these points are made of exotic materials, except I think there's a couple in there that are quartz and quartzite. Exotic meaning they're out of state. In other words, they're trading for this. They have major trade networks that go back well into the archaic period. And for example, there are jaspers that come from eastern Pennsylvania. There are rhyolites and felsites that are coming from northern New England and the Boston Basin. A lot of the cherts are actually coming from upstate New York. So they have a very complex communication system and trade network going on very early. Oh, and up here, these are carved and polished soapstone objects that were found in Lisbon, Connecticut. And they're very symbolic. This head on the left is probably a deity or an ancestor. And on the right, this is a pupa. You can see its little eyes there. And it's very symbolic of regeneration, reincarnation. And these probably came out of a burial. We aren't sure because the site was decimated by somebody actually with a bulldozer, I believe. But, so there is very sophisticated artwork and very symbolic too. In fact, there was a Jesuit priest in the late 1500s, 1600, who was stationed in Canada, writing back to Paris, and he was talking about priests who were going to be coming up there to, of course, proselytize the natives, Christianizing them. And he says that these people speak in metaphors, and if you don't understand that, you won't understand anything that they say. So, to the next slide. Also have very complex settlement systems. We know that a number of the early historic documents talk about them having a summer village and a winter village. But around each of those village sites were a whole vast number of other sites with other functions. There would be berry collecting sites. There would be nut collecting sites. There would be fishing camps. There would be hunting stations, hunting lookouts. There'd be hunting kill sites. There would be stone quarries where they would go to collect different types of stone for different types of tools. And there would be quarry workshops between the quarries and the village site, where they would work these, in these workshops, they would work down the quarry material into more efficient carryable material, so they weren't bringing a whole bunch of junk back to camp. There would also be a number of spiritual places besides the cemeteries. All of the reservations have several cemeteries associated with them now historically. Of course, there were obviously prehistoric cemeteries as well. There were also areas where people would go for having a senior moment here, to try and contact deities at certain ceremonial sites. There were also these sites where they held puberty ceremonies and other types of religious ceremonies. And all of these are located on the landscape, and they all have pathways leading to and from them to the main village site. And this is a typical, this is our replicated village up here. It's a replicated village at our museum at the Institute for American Indian Studies. Pole frame structures. Villages, historically, we know during the colonial period that there were hamlets and villages and people going back and forth all the time. And some of these small hamlets only had 20 to 30 people. Some of the villages were large enough to hold hundreds of people. They also had very complex social political organizations. And this is just a listing of, on the left, it's how many native roles and statuses one person actually could have. And in the center there are the social structures. Village would be, a tribe usually had many villages, and each one contained populations that were divided into families, but not like we think of families. We have nuclear families here, but these were large extended families, and with first cousins and second cousins and third cousins, and you were expected to know all of these people. Then the families were placed into lineages, and the major lineages were people were matrilineal. Most of their social status came from their mother's side, but they also knew their father's lineages as well. So you belonged to both, but really you came down through your mother's lineage. There were also clans. Clans had significance too, in marriage and certain religious activities, various social activities. Everybody belonged to a clan. There were also age grades, depending on how old you were. Each age grade had a right and a responsibility. Infants, children, adolescents, unmarried adults, married adults, oldsters, and elders. Not everybody was an elder. Elders were people who had special knowledge that would be helpful to the tribe. And you didn't have to be old to be an elder either. Also, gender. Certain activities were established by gender, whether you're male or female. And there were a lot of societies. There were religious societies, there were um, medical societies, there were warrior societies, and you could belong to a number of different societies. Now, over here in the roles, there were a lot of political roles. There was the Grand Sachem, and under him were the under sachems, and under them were the counselors, and then there were the powwows, who were holy men, priests. Anthropologists called them shamans. The English called them devil worshippers. They weren't. There were the various warrior societies. There were healing societies, which were often called secret societies. And of course, then there were the elders, as I said, people with important knowledge for the tribe. And most of the tribe was made up of commoners, but there were actually certain certain lineages, I suppose we could call it, where the high political leaders were drawn from. And there were servants and there were slaves, but the slaves weren't slaves forever. You could actually work your way up into being a member of the society. So, in other words, if you were living in one of these tribes, in one of these villages, you had a lot of different roles to fulfill, and it was very complicated. There were also very sophisticated art traditions. This is where sophistication comes in. And very sophisticated philosophy of life, worldview, spirituality, whatever you want to call it. Native people, traditional Native societies were very spiritual in the sense as opposed to religious, in that religion usually has its place in society. Even today, you may belong to a church. You may go to church, once a week, Sunday, or temple on Saturday. You may say your prayers at night, and that's it. But in a spiritual community, spirituality pervades everywhere. You say a prayer when you pick a plant, and it's just pervasive. In traditional Native society, it was just like that. And then you can see on here that owl effigy, the smoking pipe, and of course the owl. There are a number of characteristics associated with the owl. Spirit guide of the dead, often associated with shamans, and a lot of different characteristics of the owl that people often like and associate with. Anyway, Native people had an extremely vast knowledge of their physical environments because they'd been here so long, 12,500 years. And so they knew everything about the environment. They knew where all the animals were where they lived, all their habitats, their characteristics, where they what they ate, where they ate it, when they had when they foaled, when they had babies, whether they hibernated, where they hibernated. And the same thing with plants. They knew all about plants. They knew what the plant characteristics were like, where they grew. They knew their healing characteristics. So in other words, there are our first scientists, our first pharmacists, and our first environmental stewards, because one of the major belief systems with them is that one must always seek balance and harmony in nature, with nature, because if you don't, bad things happen. And I mean, look at our climate now. So I think that sort of proves it there. Now, coming into the early, what people call the historic period, the contact period, pilgrims were here in 1620, but there were many, many people before the pilgrims who came to New England. It goes all the way back to the Vikings. And we know the Vikings were here because there is a world heritage site up in Nova Scotia called Lamso Meadows. And it's been radiocarbon dated to AD 300 through AD 1003 to 1015. It's actually a village up there. And there are probably more. I know they've been looking for more up there. 1497, John Cabot, an Italian sailing for the English, lands in Nova Scotia. A year later, he's joined by his son, Sebastian, and they actually go all the way down the coast to North Carolina, sailing down the coast. And then there's a whole bunch of other people coming, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and others. And I just have a list of all these people coming here. Actually, this is from my book, and my book actually goes all the way up to 1619, but I couldn't fit it here. So the main point is there's a lot of European explorers and traders who were coming to Connecticut before 1600. And the trade is pretty, it's mutually prosperous on both sides here, because, of course, they're originally looking for a short route to China. Of course, they don't find it, but they meet with friendly native people who are willing to trade with them. And of course, they want the native furs because there is a fur shortage in Europe at the time. They were trading for furs with Russia, but they were pretty much, the fur-bearing animals were being depleted there quickly. And of course, fur hats were a big hot item among the upper class in Europe. So they're looking for fur trade. They're also looking for other things as well. For example, wood. There's a wood shortage in Europe as well. And of course, here they come to America where there's huge forests. So that's what the English and the French and the Dutch are looking for. The natives on their side had no metallurgy, and so they were looking for metal tools, because even though the stone tools worked just as well as the metal tools, they wore out quickly, and they took and some of them took a long time to make, especially the groundstone tools. So they were really hot to trade for metal tools, and also things like cloth, because the natives all wore skins of animals. They're hard to keep clean. Takes a while to clean them because they're animal skins. They attract fleas, and there's a lot of other, and that can be heavy during summer. So those are the two major trade items that they really wanted, and of course guns too. But there had been laws passed about doing that, but they were looking for ammunition as well. So there was a mutually satisfying relationship going on for quite a while between the explorer traders, European explorer traders, and the native people. There were some problems. You get some nasty traders, who were trying to cheat the Indians. Also, there were some cultural misunderstandings, which led to, some warfare. But by and large, the relationship was pretty mutually satisfying. There was one thing, of course, that was brought by the Europeans that wasn't too satisfying, and that was, of course, European diseases. Native people really didn't have any really terrible diseases here, and their herbal remedies would cure certain things like broken legs and any type of coughs and the usual things they had, but they had no idea what to do with the plague or smallpox or things like that, and it killed a great number of them. And this is a quote from Governor William Bradford of Plymouth Colony in talking about in 1633 there was a huge plague. It was actually smallpox that came through, and as he writes, they die like rotten sheep. They were in the end not able to help one another, no, not to make fire, nor to fetch a little water to drink, nor any to bury the dead. The chief sachem himself now died, and almost all his friend and kindred. And this epidemic not only went through Connecticut and Massachusetts, but the Dutch traders reported that it went as far as westward as the Indian plantations of which they were aware. So it decimated anywhere from, the scholars have estimated anywhere from 77 to 90% of the native population was killed off by these major epidemics. So in other words, when the English finally settle here, when they're settling, they're settling amid a very crippled society. Think about if COVID came and actually killed off 90% of our population. That would include not just average people, but you would have your police force, your warrior society, your military, you would have doctors, nurses, educators, religious people, all of your leadership in all of these various spheres gone. Not to mention the fact that while everybody is dying or recovering, that your crops are taking a dive. So when the English come here to settle, they are definitely here in very crippled societies, and because of that, the English are able to take over very quickly. In fact, over here on the right is John Minor's 1703 list of Indian warriors. The English are always very paranoid about the natives, that they're always going to rise up and kill them. Even though it really never happened in Connecticut. There was the Pequot War, which was totally different. It was involved, it involved the Pequot and the English, and I don't want to go into that, but even during King Philip's War, Connecticut Native people stayed neutral. So it was, but they were always very paranoid about it. So they sent John Minor out to count the tribes on the frontier, the western frontier, which of course was Western Connecticut. And so in this list, you can see on the left, it's the Putatuck warriors. He's counting the warriors. In the center, I think that's the Leontonac, which is a tribe. Well, the Putatuck are a tribe that covered Southbury, Woodbury, Middlebury, Oxford, that area of Connecticut. And the Leontenac were a tribe that was just north and west of them, New Milford, Kent, see where else, Danbury, that area. And then on the total right there, that is the Quinnipiac that they're counting, which was in the New Haven, West Haven, East Haven, Branford, Guilford area, and a little bit north into Cheshire and those areas. And if you count them, there's like only 20, 22 warriors for each of those tribes. I mean, if you think that each warrior is married and has 3 children, I mean, what does that come out to? It comes out to 100, 150 people at the most in the entire tribe? I don't think so. I mean, the Putatuk, they covered just so much. The Putatuk went all the way up into Litchfield. That's a that just is a humongous loss of life in each of those. It certainly shows, even though they're always underrepresented when they count them. But even if you double that, 300 people for an entire tribe that covered everywhere from Seymour, Oxford, Middlebury, Woodbury, Southbury, all the way up to Litchfield and Waterbury. Terrible. I mean, this is really a terrible thing for the native people. So Europeans quickly come in and settle the areas, and there's a lot of conflict, poverty, and community upheavals. Huge land losses for the natives. And as I said, they had no concept of single proprietorship because the tribe owned the land. So they had no idea that when the English came, that they were giving their land, selling their land permanently to these people. Mostly they probably thought they were giving them temporary use of the land, and the small amount, because like, let me think, Kettletown. Kettletown was named Kettletown because it was sold for 1 kettle. I mean, hundreds, thousands of acres sold for 1 kettle. I don't think so. What they were doing is it was tribute. They would take, for example, when inland tribes would come down to the coast in late summer and early fall, and they would fish and collect shellfish to smoke and bring back to their tribal communities for, it was a winter subsistence food. Now, the coast is heavily populated, it's always heavily populated. And so they would bring something to give to those tribes on the coast to allow them to do the fishing. And oftentimes it was just something minor to make an alliance connection. And that's probably what they thought they were doing here when they're giving, they're getting 1 kettle from the English for the entire town of Kettletown. And Kettletown by no means is one example. There's a lot of examples throughout Connecticut where they're getting minor stuff. Now, eventually, they realize what's going on when the English, and the English don't settle right away. So that's another reason they don't realize that it's permanent. But the settlers eventually come and kick them out. And then they realize what's going on. And you'll see the later deeds have a whole list of things that, yeah, we're selling this land to you, but they're selling it for a lot more than the first deeds. They're getting a lot more for it. And then they say, but we also are able to come back and hunt in our hunting areas, fish on the shore. We can take basket wood with us. And there's a whole bunch of different exceptions, to this. And of course, a lot of the land they're forced to sell it in any way because, again, they're tripled societies. They have very few warriors. They can't withstand the English. Another thing, a problem was that breaking English laws. They were fined heavily for it. They were thrown in jail, in fact, for breaking English laws, working on Sundays. Now, these people at the beginning, they didn't speak English, they didn't read English, so how do they know they're breaking the laws? They don't. Quickly find out, of course. And a lot of those fines were actually paid with land, so even more land losses. And that's why you'll see very early on they're very interested in learning English language and English ways, which means laws. And that's why they send their children, the chiefs, the sachems especially, send their children to English schools or an English minister to learn that. English farming techniques, they're clear cutting the land, and this causes a lot of erosion and filling up rivers and streams, polluting them, also polluting them with the detritus from their mills, whichever ones they have, especially the mills that come in and are starting to deal with metallurgy. Also, this clear cutting destroys a lot of animal habitat, affects white-tailed deer, which are quickly becoming extinct in these areas. By 1803, if you read some of the natural histories for a number of towns in Connecticut, by 1800, there's no big animals here. The biggest animal are groundhogs. The deer are gone. The turkey are gone. These are all major staples here. All the bear, lynx, they're all gone. And a lot of those are not only food, but were used for a number of other reasons as well. And the English actually passed laws in the late 1700s that you can't kill deer all the time, but nobody pays attention, and then they're quickly gone. So it just destroys the native economy, and it's not just deer. They're also polluting the rivers and streams, so it's killing the fish, and the fish they don't kill, they put up they put up their mills and dams, and the anadromous fish can't make it back and forth. So it just kills off all the anadromous fishing, which was a major staple, especially in the early spring. Dams pollute, industry pollutes the river, just destroying everything. I grew up in Shelton, and I remember the Naugatuck. Now I'm 74 years old, so I remember the Naugatuck River when I was a child was multicolored and iridescent. There was nothing growing in the Naugatuck in the 1950s, believe me. Not even plant material, let alone fish. And then we've really come a long way since then. Also, the 17th century wars subjugate Native people. And the 17th century wars were the 1636-1637 Pequot War. There was in southwestern Connecticut, there was Keefe's War in the 1640s. The Dutch general director of New Amsterdam that also spilled into Greenwich and Stamford. And then, of course, King Philip's War in 1675-76, and by that time, and in that war, none of the Connecticut tribes openly participated in that war, yet they were affected by it big time, because when that King Philip loses the war, he's killed, and then all of the Native people are just subjugated. They really are no longer independent people. So, and at that point, the English start attacking Indian traditions and Indian spirituality. They're passing laws that you cannot practice your your Native American religion, you have to become Christian. Um, they and there are so many other Native people in many cases aren't allowed to wear their Native clothing. Um, they what else do they have? There's a oh, of course they even want in many cases they don't allow them to practice their festivals, their socio-religious festivals, even social festivals. So there's a great deal of hardship. They can't speak their language. They aren't allowed to use their languages because the English are very paranoid and think that they may be plotting to rise up against them. So they aren't allowed to bring guns into English areas. Um, so there's a great deal of racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination going on. For example, there was the Native American Religious Freedom Act wasn't passed until 1975, I think. So there was a lot of problems, social and political problems and of course religious problems that the natives had to endure. And also because the English were so paranoid about Native people rising up against them, that they preferred to put them on reservations. And these reservations are in the worst areas. Um, they don't call Stonington for nothing. And of course, a number of the reservations for the Eastern Pequot and Mashantucket Pequot are put up in those areas. All rocky. Scatticook is another one. The only reason I think that Scatticook has endured over all of the years right up to today is because it's in a very stony, very rocky, snake-infested area. So, and of course, here are a number of the reservation communities here. And we do have some of the earliest communities in America, reservation communities, the Golden Hill Pagusset, of course, which is still ongoing, and Scatticook as well. But there were also many off-reservation Indian communities. And a lot of people don't realize this, that the town they live in has had or has an off-reservation Indian community. And here's a list of them over here west of the Connecticut River. Second Hill area in New Milford. That was a Native American area right into the mid-1900s. Beaverbrook Mountain in Danbury, Fen Road area over in Cheshire, and we're talking about 1700s, 1800s. And as I said, for the Second Hill area, it was right into the 1900s. Satan's Kingdom, Indian Heaven in Plymouth, Chewstown in Seymour, Rimmon Road, Little Ethiopia in Bridgeport, and there were many, many more. And these were just, I couldn't fit any more on here, and that's why I put it up. And, and I have a quote up here from Matthias Spies talking about the Hammonasset, where he says, it is common knowledge among the older folks living in the vicinity of Clinton that a few Hammonasset families lived in the northern part of Killingworth up to the beginning of the 19th century. They had summer villages at Madison and Clinton, and one winter village on the bank of the Hammonasset River a few miles northward from the coast. And there are a lot of these. They aren't mentioned in a lot of the town histories in Connecticut. Some of these towns, if you read their 19th century town histories, it's all white folks. But right down the street from them, there's a major Native community. So they did have a number of these communities and many of them worked as basket makers or colliers, making charcoal. Indian women would work as servants in the houses. Men did working as farm hands to support themselves to stay here because, as I said, their homelands were a very um, uh, spiritually important locality for them, and they did not want to leave. Now, all of these problems, of course, they're the loss of their economies, the racial and ethnic discrimination, um, the fact that they were already crippled by diseases. This caused a great deal of social upheaval for Native communities, and there were rapid population movements in and out of Connecticut, and sometimes out of Connecticut and then back into Connecticut. And this was done by individual people or families, but it was also done by major groups. There were major population movements. For example, the Stockbridge and the Brothertown Christian Indian movements out of southern New England. And the Stockbridge were, of course, Mohican in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, but the Mohican tribe also had homelands in northwestern Connecticut. They were a very large tribe, and they were very friendly to the English. And of course, they allowed English to move into their homelands. And so when the Stockbridge, who actually formed the Indian Company, I'm going to talk about that later, I think, but the Stockbridge Mohicans, while they were away fighting for us in the American Revolution, the white people, not all of them, but many of the white people who were living in and around the Stockbridge area were passing laws that said that the Native Americans and the free blacks could not participate in the town councils. And they were also eating up a lot of the Stockbridge homeland in that area because the people left behind, which of course were old people mostly, and women and children, were becoming increasingly indebted to the whites there because the men were away at war and they weren't getting paid much from Washington. Neither were the whites who were working for Washington at the time. So when the natives who were in the war came home, they found that a lot of the land was gone because they had to pay their debt, and they were definitely being pushed out of the area because they were no longer allowed to participate in these public meetings. So they read the writing on the wall, and they formed the Stockbridge Christian movement, and they moved westward to western New York, where they founded New Stockbridge. The Oneida tribe gave them land, and also the Brothertown movement. They gave them both land side by side on the southern border of Oneida, because the Oneidas are no fools. They realize that the whites are moving up, and they're pretty much going to start wanting to force the Oneida to give them their land. So they wanted a buffer between them. And so they gave both of those groups land, and it worked very well. They both had towns up there in western New York, and they had their own churches, their own schools, their own industries, and it was very successful until the 1820s, when the whites moved up and forced them out. And so both groups were forced to move westward and westward and westward until they got into Indian country, which was Wisconsin, and finally were able to settle there. And in fact, the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans are actually federally recognized with a large reservation in Wisconsin, and the Brothertown are recognized, state recognized, and they also have a reservation there. Now, there were a number of Native American survival strategies that they used to be able to stay in their homelands, even if they no longer own their homelands. They wanted to stay there, although, of course, some like Scatticook and Pagusset still had small portions of their homelands that were reservations. And the first thing they had to do was learn English language and laws, so that way they would be able to read the deeds and other documents that the whites wanted them to sign, because a lot of times what the whites said were on there and what was really on there were two different things. For example, the Mohegans lost a great deal of their land and share in Connecticut because what they thought they were selling and what they were really selling were two different things. And they years they contested this and complained, but to no avail. Eventually, they had to leave. So they wanted to learn English language to be able to know what they were signing, and English laws so they wouldn't be thrown in jail for like working on Sunday, things like that. Another major strategy was to become a Christian. Even though they were forced into Christianity, they realized that becoming a Christian Indian did have advantages. For one thing, a lot of the gospel societies would actually send Christian Indians free goods like blankets, clothing, things like that. Ministers from that society will often pay Indians to come to their Sunday meetings, because if they didn't have a full house of Indians in their congregation, the gospel societies in Scotland and England are going to jerk them right back and send someone else in their place. Also, to have a minister among them was very important, because minister in those days, they were the head honchos. Not like today. They had extreme power, and for them to be within an Indian community or near an Indian community would keep a lot of the whites from breaking down Indian fences, stealing their cattle, stealing cordwood. And there's a lot of, if you look in the public records of Connecticut, there's a lot of complaints from Indians that whites are breaking down fences so they can let their cattle in to chow on Indian corn, stealing cordwood, doing this, doing that. If you have a minister there, he's a major authoritarian figure that keeps the whites from, harming native societies. Also, joining the Anglo-American market economy, because as I said, once the English settled in the area, the Native American economy just tanked. So that's where they start becoming selling baskets to the farmers and the store owners. They also become farm hands. They become servants for the English, and doing a lot of other things within the market economy so that they can support themselves and their family. Another major thing was to join the military. First of all, it was actually a warrior role, which is what they had normally been used to in their own society, so it gave them status. But it also showed the whites that, yeah, we're on your side. We're protecting you. We aren't going to, we don't want to rise up and kill you in your beds. Um, it also gave them a cash economy uh, and status. So it did quite a bit for Native people. And I think I said all this. Oh, and I probably should note that although natives were forced to become Christianized, and they did have these, and some also became Christianized because they were able to get these advantages. But after the first or second generation of Christian Indians, they actually become very good Christians. And let's get that out of the way. And becoming Christian actually gave them a good foothold for actually doing social networking and political networking. They would meet for, hymn singing or meet in somebody's house to supposedly read the Bible, but they could also do a lot of native networking while they were there, because if they're meeting for Christian reasons, the whites are not suspicious. But if you go to somebody's house just to visit them and you're Indian, they're suspicious. So it was a good way of getting rid of that suspicion. Of course, another one is that ministers often taught schools for Indians for free because they wanted them to know how to read the Bible. So it was a very good way of learning how to read and write English as well. This is just a slide on the market economy over here on the left. That is the Scattercook Reservation around 1890, and that's a typical reservation house in the back. And these are the Maui sisters. Maui is a major name in Scattercook history. It's a long line of sachems come from the Maui line. In fact, James Harris, here, James Harris is a Maui, and Value Kilson. They are both major leaders at the time, doing a number of things. Part of the Scattercook Rattlesnake Club, which they actually began in the late 1800s, and it goes all the way into the 1900s. And it's actually to make friends with white authoritarian figures. White guys come up there to be macho, to catch rattlesnakes when they're coming out of their den in June. And they also they buy baskets. They also supply the natives with food when they come up. So it's a major economic activity, but it's also a political activity, because these white guys who come up to catch rattlesnakes every year are police commissioners, judges, senators, and representatives. They're also newspapermen, especially. They make a lot of friends with newspapermen, and so they're allying themselves with these white authoritarian figures in hopes that that will help them to keep their reservation lands, because they're always worried about losing the rest of what they have. And even though it's snake infested and rocky, it's still the remnant of their homelands. And it works. So also down here, basket makers, of course, are very important, but they're also doing other things as well. There's this one down here on the lower right is a soapstone brooch mold that from Pagusset silversmiths, and it was actually found on an Indian settlement in Stratford or Milford, I can't remember which one. A lot of them become charcoal makers and factory workers as well, especially when farming takes a dive in the late 1800s, and therefore when a lot of the farmers move out west, um, and so they lose their market for baskets, so they have to look for something else that's going to give them money. So a lot of them go into the factories, but also making charcoal because it is a lonely, dirty business, and many whites don't want to do it. But you find it a lot, especially in Western Connecticut, because charcoal, of course, makes the best iron. And this is actually, over here on the right, this is actually a 19th century Scattercook wood splint basket made by Scattercook for the charcoal industry, for shoveling out the charcoal briquettes. A lot of the natives also became whalers, sailors, dock workers, especially those who had homelands along the coast. And this is William Sherman, who was a major Pawgasset leader in the 1800s. He was a whaler. He spent a number of years as, in fact, he was one of the, I don't remember what they called him. He actually had a title on the whaling ship. He was second in command, I believe, and he sailed around the world twice. He made enough money to actually buy the quarter of an acre reservation that the Scattercook now still have in the Trumbull area near the Shelton line. And he was also, later after he left the whaling industry, he became a farmer and was obviously one of their major leaders at that period. And of course, Indian patriots, a lot of them go into the military. And on the left is Scattercook William Cogswell. He was one of the first to join a volunteer regiment during the Civil War. The Winstead Regiment first, but when they found out he was Indian, they wouldn't allow him in. So then he joined another regiment. I can't remember the name of it at this point. I think it was anyway. He goes in as a corporal, I think, and he quickly becomes a second lieutenant and signs up more than once. Eventually, he is wounded at one of those battles in the Shenandoah, loses a leg, I think, and dies of that later on. And where the heck is he from? Oh, what's the town next to Goshen? I can't remember it. Another senior moment, darn it. Begins with C. Anyway, he is, that township actually puts up one of those large pillar monuments to him in their cemetery. And of course, over on the right here, this is a sketch of the Stockbridge Indian Company. The Indian Company was led by the Ninnums, who were Wappinger leaders that lose their lands early on, and they come up to Stockbridge, which is basically a Mohican lands, and join the Mohicans. And so this Indian Company is made up of a lot of Mohican and Wappinger men, but there are others in there too, including Scattercook. And this is actually a sketch that was made by Von Ewald, who was a Hessian officer. and you can see exactly what they wore. Anyway, Washington, they were wonderful. The Indian Company, they fought guerrilla warfare, which was unusual at that time period, and they did a lot of damage to the British troops. And the British leader vowed to kill them off, and he actually plotted an ambush in the Van Cortlandt area of the Bronx, and they were greatly outnumbered, and I think about a third of the company was actually killed off. And so the others asked George Washington to allow them to bring the dead home, so they could, and they wanted to be able to take care of the widows and children. So he actually allowed them to leave, and actually gave them money as well. I think he gave them money as well. And there is actually a monument in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx to the Indian Company. My last slide, folks. Just basically want to talk about Native Connecticut in the 21st century. As I said, there are only 5 tribes that are recognized by the state of Connecticut: Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Eastern Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, and who's the third one I just missed? Eastern. Schaghticoke, Eastern Pequot. Anyway, I don't want to hold it up, but 2 of those, of course, are federally recognized: the Mashantucket and the Mohegan. I forgot. How could I forget Mohegan? And the rest are state recognized. And the reason they go for federal recognition, just quickly, is not because of the casinos. That's because the federal government puts them through so much hoops to prove that they are Indian. Nobody else has to prove their ethnicity. It's just the Native people that have to. They put them through so many hoops that they actually have to hire lawyers and researchers and office people to help them to do so. And it costs so much money that they have to have a backer. And it's the backers that want the casinos. And the reason Native people want to be federally recognized is because they do not have control of their reservations. Even though, for example, the 3 state tribes that are state recognized and were recognized by the colony of Connecticut even before the state, they do not control their reservation lands or their resources. The state does. And that is one reason they want to, because they want to be able to have control over. Also, the federal government will not, there's a lot of grants out there for Native people, for education for their children, for health grants for their elders, and a lot of other grants. Unless you are federally recognized. And so that is another reason that they want to be recognized. Be that as it may, besides these state and federally recognized tribes, there are a lot more tribal people in Connecticut. There are thousands who are actually residents in Connecticut, but they belong to tribes outside of Connecticut. And then there are thousands of people many years ago that actually said there were 50,000 people in Connecticut who claimed to have Native American ancestry, but were not affiliated with any tribes. And so a lot of those people are living in Connecticut. And what do? They obviously are continuing their tribal traditions. they are also attempting, as I said, to gain control over their reservations and their communities, and following on their cultural traditions, and enduring as always. That's it, folks, and I'm willing to take any type of questions that I'm allowed to.